Hi, and we're back with another episode of Bible and Theology Time. Here I am in my new office, a little farther west on the state. I'm getting myself settled in, but I wanted to get started on these again. Today, I want to talk about the notion of a scholarly consensus in theology and biblical studies, and what we can do with that, and how to respond to that when it may seem to go, at first glance at least, against what we have already thought. When I was in seminary, I had a professor who would always start his class by asking how many of his students had been warned by people in their church to beware of godless seminary professors, and almost everybody in the room always raised their hand. I think that many pastors and other people with seminary degrees often get so excited about what they've learned in school that they forget that to someone who hasn't heard about some of these ideas before, they can come off as being, mistaken at best and outright anti-Christian at worst. If pastors or other leaders come into a new church and guns blazing, it's simply assuming that everybody both knows and understands and agrees with the scholarly consensus on any given topic, they may face significant pushback from the people, and quite rightly too, because a lot of times at first hearing, some of those theories can seem like an all-out assault on someone's faith. And so today I want to talk about one way that, at least in my experience, is a way that we can engage faithfully with a scholarly consensus, especially when it seems unusual to us at first, where we can take and learn what we need to learn, but also not give up what's most important. So let me start by just naming some examples of things that have been the scholarly consensus on a topic, whether today or in years past. In fact, I want to start with the first one being something that has been super influential, but has been shown since that time it was first proposed to be at least a little bit oversimplistic. The Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, have been suggested to be a compilation of at least 4 textual traditions. One that uses Yahweh primarily to refer to God, another one that primarily refers to God as Elohim, a priestly document, and also a fourth one that is called the Deuteronomist, which is the source, as you might imagine, of much of the book of Deuteronomy. Now, that theory has been discussed and unpacked and criticized so many times since it was first proposed that it's hard to even summarize quickly what the state of play is on that topic. But I wanted to include it because, one, it's widely known by a lot of people, and two, it's a great example of the kind of theory I'm talking about, which when someone hears it for the first time, they go, wait a minute, I'm not sure I believe that. Another scholarly consensus is that the book that we call Isaiah may actually be a compilation by at least 2 authors over the period of a couple centuries of time. You may hear people refer to 2nd and 3rd Isaiah when referring to the later chapters of the book. Now, there are 2 main scholarly consensus issues surrounding Paul's letters that might seem unusual to people. The first one is whether all the letters that Paul sends are all individual letters that were beginning to end exactly what was sent on one occasion, or whether perhaps some of them at least might be compilations of 2 or more letters that have been put together by an editor. The other major scholarly issue around Paul's letters is whether or not some of them may not have been written by Paul himself, but may have been penned by someone else, perhaps a close disciple or a protege of his. The scholarly consensus is that as many as 6 of the 13 letters we attribute to Paul may actually have been written by somebody else. Another theory that is widely known is that the Gospels may not necessarily be simply direct testimony from eyewitnesses, as we often might think, but that the authors may have been as much editors, gathering and arranging material passed down through the oral tradition of the early church. I'm not going to go in much detail about that one right now because I plan to do a whole video on that topic a little bit down the line. Now, many people, and I include myself in this, have something of a bad reaction when they first hear about these various theories that they say is a scholarly consensus. A lot of times it can feel at first, when you first hear about them, that it's an attack on the faith. It's an attack trying to tear down what the church has believed for over 2,000 years, and sometimes it feels like it's not putting something constructive back in its place. Not only does it feel sometimes like an attack on the faith, it also can sometimes feel that the term scholarly consensus gets used as like a club to beat down people who raise questions about it. It seems to say, this is what all the smart people think. If you don't agree with it, what does it say about you? Speaking personally, I found it very helpful to try to go back and find out just where this theory came from. Because a lot of times, more often than not, it turns out scholars have found a problem in the text. And when I say problem in the text, I mean a problem with how we're reading the text, not necessarily a problem with the text itself. That those problems make it hard for us to read it the way we might otherwise want to. And so the scholarly consensus is oftentimes just trying to find the best answer possible to deal with those issues. And so essentially, a scholarly consensus is really oftentimes nothing more than just a bunch of people who have thought a lot about the issue saying, we think this is the best way to answer the questions. So what are the kinds of problems we're talking about? Well, when it comes to the Torah, what scholars began to realize is that there were certain differences in styles and vocabulary, and you would have consistent style and vocabulary for a whole chunk of writing, and then you'd have a suddenly very different one. And that those different kinds of styles are almost recognizable authors that don't just show up in one book or another, but can be found throughout the entire Torah. Now, one particularly dramatic example of this could be the double creation narrative at the beginning of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 1, we have God doing what we could call a very impersonal creation story, where we read about God simply declaring, and then it is, and God declares it's very good. And it's incidentally, the author uses the word Elohim for God in that chapter. And then in Genesis chapter 2, we have the account of God creating the first human being, not just by a word, but by handcrafting that first person and breathing life into him. And incidentally, the word being used for God throughout that whole narrative is Yahweh. And so the argument is that it seems strange that one person would write both of those stories with such different vocabulary and different styles and then put them side by side in the final text. The theory basically says it is easier to believe that someone grouped those stories together based on their similar content, but they weren't the one who wrote them both. It was a compilation rather than an individual author. My point, though, is not that you have to agree with the scholarly consensus, but that to remember that that's an answer to a particular interpretational problem, and to go back to that problem and see maybe if you can find a better way of doing it if you don't like the scholarly consensus. Maybe we'll come up with another interpretation that doesn't feel so hostile to our faith and to the faith of others. But the one thing we can't do, at least if we're pastors and other church leaders, is close our eyes to the problem just because we don't like the proposed solution. Well, what about Isaiah? The first 39 chapters of Isaiah are all full of warning and criticism and usually pointing forward to some kind of coming disaster. Well, the historical events and people that are in the background of that first 39 chapters makes it pretty clear that this author is writing in the setting of the 8th century BC. Now we know, as both a matter of archaeology and biblical testimony, that the fall of Jerusalem that it seems to be predicted didn't actually happen until about the 5th century BC. Now, the reason why that becomes a problem for us is because from chapter 40 on, the prophet seems to be talking about the events of the fall of Jerusalem as if they've already happened in the past. Now, if we didn't know the timeline, if we didn't know there was supposed to be a couple hundred years gap there, what we might do if we read the account is we might just simply say it's the same prophet who lived through the transition, and leading up until that point he had one message, and then once it happened he had another message. And so the choice we seem to be stuck with is that if the early part of Isaiah is taking place in the 8th century, and if it's talking about the fall of Jerusalem that wouldn't happen until the 5th century, then we're faced with either the one prophet in the 8th century is accurately predicting what was going to happen several hundred years in the future and was proactively giving words of comfort to people who are surviving a crisis that hasn't happened yet, or we seem to be put in the situation where perhaps the second part of the book was written by somebody else. And so the issue in the background of all of this is what exactly does the Bible mean when it talks about prophecy? Because if somebody has a very strong notion that prophecy is primarily about telling the future, then this idea that Isaiah is telling the future as if it's in the past is not a problem. In fact, if that's one's view, then to raise the question that maybe it's being written by somebody else, what that will do is it will feel like an attack on the very biblical notion of prophecy itself. And if that's the case, it's hard to understand it as anything short of something that's radically calling the authority of the scriptures into question. Now, the counter argument would be that perhaps the dominant theme of prophecy in the Old Testament is actually something more like political and social commentary, that what they're doing is they're saying to the people in power, this is what's happening now, and this is what we can expect if things don't change in the future. And so, if it's true that prophecy is not so much foretelling, but forthtelling, as in telling the truth to people who don't want to hear it, then you can have two authors represented in the book of Isaiah without actually going against what biblical prophecy is all about. Now, the question as to whether or not some of Paul's letters might actually be compilations rather than just single letters seems to come from there are moments where there are really odd, strange transitions when Paul is writing, so that it almost seems like he's going on one topic, and then he stops and talks about something completely different for a while, and then goes back to that first topic without seeming to have missed a step or to notice that anything odd happened in the meantime. In other cases, we have Paul saying something like finally, and then going on for a while, and then all of a sudden, a chapter or two later, we have him saying finally again. And it seemed as though perhaps those were two different letters, that the compiler thought that both of those finallys were important. And so again, the scholarly consensus on that particular topic seems to have less to do with trying to discredit Paul as it is to deal with the fact that the other alternative we seem to have is to say that Paul was perhaps not a very attentive writer, which that does seem hard to believe based on other things we know about Paul and his writings. Now, one of the other particularly scandalous notions about Paul's letters is that perhaps some of the letters that we are attributed to him may not have been written by him. And a lot of that has to do, but not entirely, with the fact that there are certain stylistic and vocabulary consistencies that are in the undisputed Pauline letters that simply aren't necessarily there in the other ones. And so the question becomes, why would Paul write in one style for so long across so many years only to suddenly change it here and there for these other letters? And I want to note again that to say that Paul may not have written all the letters that bear his name is not the same thing as to say that they're not all important or that they're not all in the scripture. It's simply a question about who actually put pen to paper and the problems that arise if we assume that it was one person who wrote all 13. Now, I apologize that this has been a bit of a long video, a long discussion, but I wanted to at least give enough background and enough examples so it's really clear what I'm talking about here. One of the points I want you to understand is that none of these issues are new. Attentive readers of scriptures have noticed these issues in the text, or our problems with those issues, since the very beginning, and they've had different ways of dealing with it. And some of those ways might seem even more strange and foreign to us today than these modern scholarly consensus views. What I want to say is that these questions are always being raised within the context of the worshiping life of the church, and never as an outsider position. These problems have never been seen as a reason to give up faith. In fact, it seems noteworthy to me, at least, that these scholars very well may see themselves as championing the authority of Scripture, because when they see these questions that we have, they don't conclude the Bible is irrational and self-contradictory and should be given up. What they do then is say, how can we understand it so that it makes sense from all these points of view? And so the conclusion is not the Bible is hopelessly flawed. The conclusion is we might need to learn a better way of reading Scripture. And the possibility that we might be doing something wrong and need to learn a better way is certainly a very Christian idea. So, when you hear a view being described as the scholarly consensus, does that mean you have to agree with it? Of course not. What it does mean is that there are issues in the text that we are not really free, especially as leaders in the church, to simply ignore. They're issues that we have to deal with one way or the other. A consensus view that's at odds with what you already thought you believed does not necessarily mean you're wrong, but it does mean it's possible you have not considered all the aspects fully. The consensus is just simply trying to say we think this is the best answer based on what a lot of us who have thought about the issue deeply have concluded. But the consensus does not necessarily mean it's right, as we know, because the scholarly consensus on various topics has shifted over the years. What it does mean it's an important issue and we need to take it seriously. And it means that we can't make the problem go away by rejecting one particular interpretation of it. So, don't accept every consensus you hear about. Try to find out why they said what they said. Try to understand the deep root issue that they're trying to grapple with. And you may find that their consensus starts making a lot of sense. Or you may find that it makes no sense. The point is, you won't really know where you land on the topic until you've really grappled with the issue. Well, that's all I have for this week. As always, if you have found these videos helpful, please like and share them on the various social media platforms. If you have any questions or topics you'd like me to take up, please send me an email at pastorstevik@gmail.com. You can also watch these videos on the YouTube channel where these are generated, which is /tstevik1. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.